The work of Shakespeare is very commonly taught in educational curriculums around the world because of Shakespeare's amazing command of story through the literary element of dramatic irony, or more simply put, when the audience is aware of something that the characters in the play are not aware of. It's used in the play Othello when the audience knows that the villainous Iago has planted Othello's wife's handkerchief in another man's room. This leads to Othello's suspicion of an affair happening. And then it's also used in King Lear, as the audience watches Lear as he slowly realizes that his own arrogance led him to losing those who truly loved him. Every single time, the audience is aware of something that somebody in the play is not aware of, which even today expertly grabs our attention. These characters are pushed into deeply emotional situations, and all the audience can do is watch it play out. Macbeth is one of the most famous plays by William Shakespeare, and it stands out in his catalog of plays as one of the best displays of dramatic irony being driven by fate. It's also probably my personal favorite story he's ever written. I would highly recommend you watch the 1971 film by Roman Polanski. It's just an amazing film, and I'm going to be using it whenever I refer to Macbeth. So anyways, our main character Macbeth initially learns that he'll become king through the word of fate by some witches, and then eventually he learns by those same exact witches that he'll be dethroned. The prophecy they tell him is that he'll be dethroned when the Burnham Woods move towards his castle, and he'll also be defeated by somebody who wasn't born by a mother. This makes Macbeth certain that he'll never be dethroned, but the audience on the other hand is more certain of his downfall. This is because something that everybody in the audience knows is that fate cannot be thwarted no matter how peculiar it sounds. Even though Macbeth is blind to this downfall, the audience knows that it's gonna happen by the end of the play. It's the big conclusion we sense is coming. And by the end of the play, enemy soldiers cloak themselves in the branches of the woods as they approach his castle. And thus, the first part of the prophecy, the Burnham Woods moving towards his castle, comes true. And then at the very end, Macbeth finally fights Macduff. Macbeth claims his invincibility. He can't be killed by somebody birthed from a mother. In the film, he literally says this when he's fighting people.
Thou wast born of woman.
He knows that these people will not lead to his downfall. That is, until Macduff explains that he wasn't traditionally birthed. He was delivered through a C-section.
Let fall thy blade on vulnerable crests. I bear a charmed life, which must not yield to one of woman born.
To spare thy charm, and let the angel whom thou still hast served tell thee, Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped.
And at that moment, a part of Macbeth realizes something that the audience was aware of this entire time. There's a possibility that he can be dethroned, and that's exactly what happens. This is the dramatic irony of this story. If only he wasn't so arrogant due to the prophecy that he thought would never happen. And the audience just watches as this person that we initially viewed as a hero is dethroned and cast aside. Whenever fate is used by Shakespeare, it creates this inherent disconnect between the audience and the characters in the play, because reflecting on these situations in a self-aware way creates this sense of drama and possibly dread, that feeling where you want to look away because you know what's about to happen, but you just can't. As much as I love these original plays though, the way that humans consume media has advanced so much further from these stage performances and movies. In the last few decades, the human species has adapted what is by far the most immersive and deeply individual art forms our species has produced: video games.
Mine!
No, George. Mine.
The new video computer system by Atari.
Higher demand than the Cabbage Patch doll was.
A stunning new generation of interactive entertainment.
No, The Rock, even at 1/5 of his power, would still blow everybody out of the water, just like the Xbox.
He would like to play.
Video games have been able to form this sort of bridge that no other type of media has been able to make. Whereas for any other form of media, they would be showing you something play out. Here you actively take part in the story. Whether it happens to you as it unfolds or you're actively participating in choosing the main events, where in other forms of media you're watching something happen to characters that sure you formed connections with, but here you are that character. You're linked to them with an IV running their blood into yours. This new art form has been expanded, gone through multiple generations, but have you ever thought of what what we've lost in terms of storytelling since this new form of media has rolled into our society and our homes. You see, the point of my video today is to use one of the only popular video game franchises in recent years that actually uses fate through its main plot, God of War. And then I'm going to use it to describe how, compared to traditional uses of fate in Shakespearean and, of course, Greek literature and just general literature and storytelling, there's important elements of storytelling like fate and dramatic irony that must be kind of changed to fit the different nature of video games. The original God of War series and also the newer revamped remake/dimension shift series both utilize fate in surprisingly different ways, but both kind of do it completely differently than how it was done in, let's say, the original Shakespearean context that I provided earlier. This is a video about God of War, but it's also about how the very nature of video games and how, although you may not consider it very often, the pivotal differences between games and other forms of storytelling describes the shift in which modern stories are now crafted. Stories are now made completely differently. But anyways, let's now talk about the original PS2/PS3 God of War games, the original trilogy. Let's talk about their approach to fate and storytelling. The original God of War trilogy was mostly a sort of re-envisioned version of the classical Greek stories. All of the gods and important fables are mostly represented, yet our new original character, Kratos, who wasn't originally a part of Greek mythology, is the sort of one traversing through these stories. Not in the sense that these stories are actively happening around him, but more like the people and key plot points of these stories exists in this world. But that being said, their whole existence is very video gamey. I mean, these started off as PS2 games after all. A lot of these things are just there to create a way for the player and Kratos to interact with them. Kratos' backstory itself is very tragic. So as you can see, essentially to win a big battle, he pledges his servitude to Ares, the god of war. But in Kratos' warpath, he accidentally kills his wife and daughter. Now, Kratos' character can be summarized mostly by one word: anger. Even though he has tons of regret, remorse, and just sadness inside of him from this whole inciting incident that chained him to the gods, he killed his family, all of that goes into fueling one emotion: rage. Now, the plotline of the first game kind of picks up, and essentially when Kratos finds out that Ares is the one who put his wife and child there to be killed, to turn Kratos into this perfect warrior not bound to the mortal world at all. This of course makes Kratos a little bit angry. So after breaking his servitude from Ares by, of course, fucking killing him, he himself becomes the god of war. Anyways, the plot of the original games is very complex and convoluted, but essentially, of course, he becomes the new god of war by the end of the first game, and if it isn't obvious, around the second game, it turns out that the other gods are, of course, very scared of Kratos. I mean, he fucking killed Ares, one of the toughest gods. So he does tasks and whatnot for the Olympians, but eventually, Zeus kills Kratos because of how scared he is of him. Of course, this is Greek mythology, so it just sends Kratos to the underworld, and so then Kratos' new goal is to find the Sisters of Fate and change his past, and restore his status as a god, and then finally, of course, kill Zeus. Okay, so the Sisters of Fate obviously don't let Kratos just change his fate, so he says thank you for your time and walks away. I'm fucking kidding, of course. He kills and massacres them all. He reverses his fate and he time travels and stabs Zeus. Anyways, that leads to this moment at the end of the game.
You cannot do this, Kratos!
You dare stand against me, Athena?
I do not wish to fight you, Kratos, but I will defend Olympus!
Know this, my son. You have started a war you cannot possibly win. The fates have already deemed me victorious.
No, Kratos! Stop!
No!
Okay, so then this all basically leads to God of War 3, the big finale where Kratos finally goes on a rampage and kills all of the gods. I mean, he literally kills fucking all of the gods. And of course, this has its consequences on the Earth. The gods control particular parts of the world, and so when they die, those parts go into disarray and the entire world is ravaged. But now, let's think for a second about how the Sisters of Fate were used in this story versus how the Witches of Fate are used in Macbeth. Obviously in most Greek stories that include the Fates and whatnot, because they are a very popular character in Greek mythology, fate is mostly used as a plot device to just inform somebody of something. The Fates very typically just give somebody a prophecy, and the person then tries to avoid that prophecy. Yet again, that prophecy ultimately takes place, whether the characters like it or not. This of course is very similar to Macbeth in Shakespeare's tales. In Macbeth, even though the Sisters of Fate were defined characters with personalities and roles in the main plot, again, they do nothing other than drive forward the dramatic irony. They tell Macbeth of his future, and it seems so absurd and impossible, even though the audience knows that fate will somehow play out. Macbeth's arrogance leads him to blindness towards his own downfall. He was a great warrior and king with so much power, yet he was blind to his own hamartia, his fatal flaw, which ironically leads to his own defeat. That description is so funny because it's literally applicable to so many Shakespearean and ancient Greek stories. Yet let's now think about God of War again. Let's think about video games. Have you ever played a video game where the main character doesn't know something, but you, the player, were aware of it? In a good majority of games, no! The reason is because in a game, because you're controlling the main character and going through the actions of the story alongside them, there would be a huge disconnect if you knew something that they didn't. To guide a character in the right way, you have to want the same things as them. You should want to do what they want to do. I've been using Uncharted 4 footage through this segment because through the main course of the game, you know everything that Nathan knows. As you continue through the main plot, you find out the twists and barriers at the same time he does. And if there ever is a moment in a game like this where the player does know something that the character doesn't, then why wouldn't you just guide the character into a different direction? If you control them, then you're meant to control them into the right situation. I mean, the character doesn't know what's happening, but you do. It creates a huge problem I bet many of you never thought about. Luckily in video games, this idea isn't very common, purely because you almost always see the main story through the eyes of your main character. So for the most part, the developers can't really hide things from you. They can't really hide things that you wouldn't be aware of otherwise. The only instances I can think of where the player expects something that the main character doesn't expect of are in very short and quick sequences. For instance, at the very start of the game Heavy Rain. I'm only bringing this up by the way because yes, there definitely are small exceptions to this rule, yet they aren't very common. Okay, so what I'm talking about is at the very start of the game when you're searching for your lost son in a shopping mall. You finally find him, yay! And even though the main character is definitely relieved, there's this kind of feeling that things won't go as they should. It's not really told to you that something's about to happen, but there's just this feeling that this is a very clear red herring. And then boom! The audience felt like something was coming, but the main character kind of... The audience felt like it was coming, but the main character didn't. And that only worked because this moment was such a short burst. There was a very slight disconnect. You can feel it coming, but it allows for the rest of the game to continue. And of course, this is often a common trait in thrillers or horror games, as those games are sort of setting up an atmosphere to keep you on your feet. But nonetheless, once again, these are very short and quick instances of audience to character disconnect. Okay, so that's a lot of information, but just to summarize, video games cannot have fate or, more importantly, dramatic irony work how it does in any other type of storytelling. That's because, very simply put, the fact that you control the main character means it's unreasonable to make you know something that the main character does not. The original God of War trilogy uses this by turning fate into a much more changeable and metaphysical property. It's almost like a tool that Kratos and the other gods can use to their advantage. This is the first way that I think the God of War series sort of changes the rules of fate to make it work in the context of video games. It does eliminate the aspect of dramatic irony, that's the important thing to remember, but still, I bet it was really cool for players back in the day who didn't know if Kratos would actually be able to change his fate or not, do something that hasn't really been done for almost any one of these classical stories. But he does, and it allows for fate to work in the context of video games. Again, no dramatic irony, no disconnect between Kratos and the player, but it changes fate in a way that works. Here's the interesting part, and I'll pose it in a question. Did Kratos really run around his fate? Did he actually break free from it? As we all know, at the end of the third game, Kratos finally kills Zeus, who he finds out is actually his father. Kratos, just like Zeus and just like a lot of these other gods in these myths, ultimately kills his father, which, like it or not, is a common trope in the prophecies of Greek mythology. Despite killing and fighting to resolve his sins, literally killing the Sisters of Fate to break free from his prophesized ending, he still somehow fell back onto one thing that the gods were always known for, killing his own father. And that's how, even though the original God of War games break from fate, they like post-dramatic ironically work back around into making Kratos fall into his sort of fate. By the way, I hope that that's one of the first times anybody says the phrase post-dramatic irony. It's a really fucking cool idea. So Kratos kills Zeus. He kills his father. So anyways, after the destruction of the world, a trick ending, and a whole dimension shift later, which by the way is still not completely explained, this leads us to the modern God of War games, the newer God of War series. So the newer God of War series plays off fate as well, especially in the last game that came out, God of War Ragnarok, and it does it in a very interesting but mildly confusing way. It is much different than the original God of War trilogy, yes, but it's also still very different from that custom Macbeth and traditional mythology way. I'm gonna dive into that in a second, but first, I want to take a break to discuss the way that games actually do let dramatic irony play out, as it's not necessarily from putting the main character into that core narrative position, but instead, it turns the character you play as into the audience for a whole separate story, allowing the player to stay connected to the main character, but also allowing for complex plots. It allows for that dramatic irony, it allows for the audience of the game to sort of view things from an outsider perspective, but again, you stay connected to the main player. This is really interesting. So, Witcher 3. Okay, so I don't want the point of this video to be that video games are not able to tell stories with complex themes and literary devices. In fact, the actual point is far from that. Most of the points from this video and many previous videos have been how video games are different in their approach to storytelling, yes, but that allows for so much more detailed and interesting storylines to occur. Also, as the hit video game Witcher 3 shows, stories that use dramatic irony and allow the audience to really disconnect from the characters in the plot and have this introspective outlook on the plot's ideas can exist in video games. So up to now, I've been making the point that fate and the use of fate to create dramatic irony in games cannot exist for the main character in a story. It's really hard to do, but this is mostly for the main character, because of course, you can't have this disconnect between the player and the main character that they're playing as. But what if the main character becomes a sort of audience to another side story? You see, this is how Witcher 3 and most other RPGs have been able to create really intense storylines within video games. The main story of Witcher 3 is a fun plot with our boy Geralt, but where everybody agrees everything picks up is in the side stories that are often so much more complex than the main plot. By the way, I'm not the biggest Witcher 3 fan, so this segment is far from a review of the game, but if you're interested in something like that, Jack Sather has a really great Witcher 3 video. But anyways, back to my main point. A sort of example of what I'm trying to describe is, let's say, the Bloody Baron storyline. That's very early on in the game. In fact, I decided to point him out because a lot of the Bloody Baron's flaws and character traits can be tied to our good friend Macbeth. You're introduced to him by directly seeing how he controls his land with an iron fist, yet as you meet him, you find out how his pride and arrogance has led him to losing those who are closest to him. You find his Hamartia, it's cool as hell. Geralt, our main boy, is a witcher. He's often like a mercenary, fulfilling tasks big and small, conquering and killing huge beasts, but also just solving random mysteries. That's why he's a perfect character to be an audience to a Shakespearean play as it plays out in front of you. You slowly unveil the pieces and view the weaknesses of the characters. The people that witness this dramatic irony are Geralt and you, the player. You can see how things are headed, but many of the main characters in the side stories are oblivious to it. Okay, so this is exactly why I decided to talk about The Witcher 3 and the Bloody Baron storyline in this video. Whereas all of my previous and future God of War critiques are showing video games working around traditional elements of storytelling like fate, The Witcher 3 and the Bloody Baron storyline reflect how video games can actually have the traditional sense of dramatic irony like in Macbeth. As the audience watches the play Macbeth, they view this very flawed but also somewhat sympathetic character going through a vicious downfall. The Bloody Baron is exactly like that, and we get so many of those similar emotions and story beats. Like in Macbeth, how you see him slowly realize that he can be dethroned. In the Bloody Baron storyline, you slowly see him realize how his actions caused all of this terribleness around him. Him being abusive and narcissistic is what pushed away his family to not being able to even live with him anymore. And the physical effects, like his dead baby coming back from the dead, are all things that he caused. He has to deal with the repercussions of his actions. In both Macbeth and the Bloody Baron storyline, there's this thought that only if this character could look and see their flaws, maybe they'd make the right choices. But in the Bloody Baron storyline, just like in Macbeth, it's the Hamartia and these toxic traits of the main character that leads them to their own downfall, and the whole dramatic situation of the plot. There's tons of great side stories in Witcher 3, and what it shows for us in the purpose of this video is how there can be these intense storylines in video games. I mean, I literally made a whole 3-hour video on Fallout. By the way, thank you so much for those people who are watching this video because of that, it really blew up. And one of the main things that makes the Fallout series amazing, just like Witcher 3, are the amazing side stories. JRPGs, Western RPGs, tabletop RPGs, which are the games that inspired some of those original CRPGs, which then inspired many video games we now adore today. All of these have amazing cases of complex and detailed stories. Most of them utilize literary elements, even if the creators didn't originally intend to. There's dramatic irony like I've been describing, yes, but there's also allegories, foreshadowing, symbolism. Everything your high school English classes try to point out to you, they exist in video games, and especially in RPGs because of how they tie the player to these worlds specifically made for storytelling and customization. Okay, so I can't lie, I don't love The Witcher 3. The controls, the main story, a lot of it doesn't really do it for me. But I was hooked on this game back in middle school because I could delve deep into these rich stories where Geralt, who more often than not becomes this very blank character for the player to project themselves onto, is just an audience for things to occur. Dramatic irony works in games, not really for the main character for whom you form a connection to and play as, but it works in the context of being able to play out inside of stories and side characters other than the main character. Just like the Bloody Baron storyline that I was mentioning just a few moments earlier. Dramatic irony can work, but it's kind of tricky at times. Now that leads us back to God of War. This Witcher 3 argument was much more of a side rant, but here, now let's delve deep into God of War again. Let's delve deep into the way that fate can work to create really interesting feelings and storylines in a video game for the main character. I explained earlier in this series how despite killing the sisters of fate, Kratos inadvertently falls back into his fate with his need to kill his father, just like so many of the other Greek gods. And despite his will to change his life, change his path, God of War Ragnarok, if anything, shows how truly hard that is. How truly hard it is to escape your destiny. Let's talk again about God of War. God of War 2018 portrayed a much different Kratos. Yes, he's still the same Kratos from the previous games, but now much older and much more humbled. He's created a new family with a woman who just passed away, with also a preteen son who has yet to find out the fact that he has the blood of a god inside him. Their journey to spread their mother's ashes on the highest peak in the realms takes place, and honestly, that's most of the story. There are complications with other gods and Kratos having to return to his past, return to the chains that originally bound him to Ares to be able to save his son. But otherwise, the story is just deep and personal, and more importantly, very, very simple. Some parts like the Atreus becoming evil side story was a little bit sucky.
It's all you ever talk about, over and over. Do something about it or shut up already.
But honestly, this game still had a lot going for it, and most importantly, in how it could tell this deep story while both being connected and disconnected from three of the most lore-complex games of the PS2 and PS3 era. I did review God of War 2018 a long time ago on this channel, but it was before I understood how to do this sort of thing. My voice was high, and I used PlayStation Share Factory to edit.
You should definitely subscribe, because I'm planning on, putting a lot more videos like this up.
Please do not watch that video, but even back then, I liked this game a lot, and I understood its main purpose.
Their end goal is just pushing Kratos and his son closer together, and Kratos doesn't really like to show emotion, so the biggest triumph that he has to get through is showing his son that he truly loves him.
Anyways, at the end of this game, when reaching the peak of the tallest mountain, Kratos and his son Atreus finally discover a shrine made by the giants. Among them, there were prophecies. Yes, prophecies of Atreus, who we actually discover is Loki. We see Atreus joining Odin in Asgard, and we also see the coming of Ragnarok. But most importantly, there's what Atreus doesn't see here. What Atreus doesn't see, but Kratos does, is Kratos dying in Atreus' arms. And from here, we get into Ragnarok. Oh, fuck. God of War Ragnarok picks up a bit after 2018, but it starts off by throwing us into lore and storylines. Odin, Thor, Thor's family, Asgard. Characters from God of War 2018 are expanded upon, and our main cast of friends is added to. I went through and tried to summarize the main game's plot in my notebook after I beat it, but it was really hard because there's so much character swapping and juggling storylines. It's a huge diversion from the very deep but not as complex story of God of War 2018. Ragnarok, despite not being that many hours longer than 2018, still feels like it has almost double the amount of story content. I wouldn't be surprised if this in 2018 were originally going to be some part of a trilogy, with Ragnarok being the huge conclusion, because honestly there's a good amount of story content here that I could easily see being expanded upon further. But I guess maybe with the length that it takes to make games nowadays, they decided not to do that. So this game is driven by fate. You see, Atreus attempts to follow his fate, which does make a lot of sense. I mean, he's a young demigod with a whole ass future ahead of him. He's really excited, but Kratos does not share that sentiment. Not because of the prophecy of his death, honestly. He's not really worried about that, as far as we can see, but he's actually just more worried about Atreus. Kratos knows how easily arrogance can go to the head of gods. Obviously shown in the original trilogy, but hell, it literally happened to Atreus in the first game of the new series, when he literally became a little brat. As excited as Atreus is, all Kratos can see is the fate that he ultimately succumbed to at the end of the first series. The defeat that faced all of Olympus and the gods. Kratos' mantra, "we must be better," is so personal to him because he had to work so hard at even slightly becoming a different person. And Atreus, young and filled with some arrogance for sure, Kratos sees in him the possibility to be good, but also the ability to fall into his arrogance. That's why Kratos fights against Atreus going to Asgard and meeting Odin and all the other gods. Seeing these other gods in their arrogance and pride can lead Atreus down a bad path. Anyways, this is where the fate part of the story really sets in. Many things are professed, for instance Atreus going to Asgard and becoming pals with Odin. Well, that happens really fast. Also, there's Ragnarok, the prophesized destruction of the gods in all the realms. Even though Atreus and Kratos kind of try to prevent it, it feels like all they end up doing is witnessing it happen, one event after another. And possibly one of the biggest prophecies we learn is how Kratos is professed to kill Heimdall, a very stuck-up and mean god. I mean, this is literally our introduction to him.
Hello. Hi. So, what part of the enormous wall made you think, oh, visitors must be welcome? Ah!
But nonetheless, Kratos doesn't want to kill Heimdall. He doesn't want this prophecy to come true. As much as Kratos and the player want this arrogant fuck to die, killing Heimdall only pushes further the other prophecies that we don't want. And not to mention, killing him, one of Odin's top guys, would really mess things up, and easily lead to Ragnarok. We don't want this. We don't want this fight, yet it happens. At the very last moment, Kratos gives him up. We have the option to spare him. We want things to change. We want it to be better. But then, we just can't stop this prophecy.
Is this about the little runt? Oh, now I am definitely going to gut him.
Brother! This isn't who you want to be!
This was a very big moment for me as I really started to question what the hell are the rules of fate in this universe. We just saw Kratos try his best to run around his fate, yet of course it ends up happening. So are the rules of fate similar or different than the rules in his original universe? Let's talk about that a bit. Of course we know how Kratos went around his fate in the original storyline. He killed the Sisters of Fate and literally reversed what happened. But in Ragnarok, we visit the Norns, and this is the Norse mythology versions of the Sisters of Fate. Yet this scene plays out very eerily. It's actually reminded to us by a piece of dialogue that Kratos did kill the Sisters of Fate in his original universe. It's canon, literally listen.
The legends I heard about the ghost of Sparta were surely exaggerated. Exaggerated.
Oh, not in the brazen bloodshed's righteous fury part. The part where it said you travelled back in time itself to win a battle once lost. It's strange credulity, obviously.
It is the truth. The threads of fate span all life and time. The Sisters of Fate abused their power. When I challenged them, they threatened to undo my existence. So I killed them and turned their power on Zeus.
That's the most dangerous and irresponsible thing I've ever heard.
But Freya, one of the main side characters in the game, shares how what he did in his original universe really isn't possible in this universe.
Fate can be overcome.
I used to think so. When the Norns told me of my son, I thought I could change it. You know well how that worked out.
The Norns. The fates of these lands.
That's right. You defy prophecy at your own peril.
The Sisters of Fate controlled fate, but the Norns, despite being very powerful, don't really have control over it. They share knowledge, and similar to Macbeth and classical tales, they have no ability to change fate. Thus, fate works much more traditionally in this sense. I spent so much time wondering if somehow Kratos would fight against fate, if he would be able to rise up, similar to God of War 2, and change the ending. Yet that doesn't happen. That's why, if you know what happened in the original trilogy, how Kratos did change his fate, it really elevates the story of Ragnarok. The fact that this similar situation of Kratos fighting against fate has happened before, yet this time he really has to accept that he can't just change the outcome of this world, it adds really great complexity to the core storyline of the game. You get this amazing sense of dread and longing with Kratos as you feel limited by the rules of this new world. It's really cool, and this is one of the most important things I think this game does in terms of fate. It, in a way, mirrors the original dread and feeling you get by traditional uses of fate with Macbeth and dramatic irony, but it's not the same concepts. It's not dramatic irony. But okay, let's continue on. So I didn't mention Angrboda and that sort of small storyline earlier in the video, by the way, because very honestly, it's so unimportant to the main plot of the game, I didn't think it was necessary to talk about, except for maybe a few core moments. But nonetheless, Angrboda is where I really start to question the truth of the role of fate in this story. It's where I kind of got really annoyed when I first played through the game, because I still didn't understand how this thing worked. Okay, so I said that the Norns show that fate cannot be changed, and that is kind of true, but not really. So in the story, Angrboda describes Atreus' fate to him, and tells him that all these prophecy-driven things are bound to happen. Yet one small part of her prophecy is that she's bound to tell Atreus' fate, yet once that core part is done, once she's done telling him his fate, she tells him that she's not supposed to be a part of his story any longer.
What happens to you now?
I don't know. Once you're gone, my part in this is over.
I think your part is as big as you want it to be.
She's not supposed to really interact with Atreus after this event. This is her one main part in the story, and she knows, because she knows fate, that she's not supposed to really do anything else. Yet that being said, she continuously shows up and pops up around the main plot. Atreus interacts with her a lot, and she even helps in the final battle of Ragnarok.
Angrboda! I knew you'd show up!
It's not shown in any prophecy, it wasn't really a part of fate, but she helps in that final battle, and at the end of the game, when everything is finally over, her and Atreus kind of go off on their own. Despite fate saying that she won't, she still is a part of the main story, but why does this happen? Why is fate a kind of unreliable narrator of the story? Okay, so this is all because as Atreus sort of figures out over the course of the game, fate is set in stone, it is, but it's mostly just like the core anchor points throughout a story that are really professed before they happen. By the end of the story, the main message is that even though their lives are already kind of predetermined by fate, you can still determine things like how you behave, how you treat other people, how you react in those moments and situations that aren't already determined by fate. It's kind of a sad and foreboding conclusion to make, the fact that things are bound to happen, but you're really just able to change the main things in between them. But still, in a story where it feels like you're constantly fighting against your own fate, and constantly trying to figure out if the events that are professed are actually going to unfold, it's really, really nice and comforting to know that these characters do have this sort of loose sense of free will. And that's how the new God of War series uses fate. It doesn't use it for dramatic irony like Macbeth, it doesn't turn fate into some sort of set thing that has the ability to change like in the original God of War trilogy, but it's a device that's used to highlight the actual free will of the characters in the main story. Kratos, our main character, who I described in one word at the start of this video, anger, has now separated himself from the past. Before, he fought against fate, but he doesn't do that anymore. He does do his best to prevent it from happening, but when the plot ultimately unravels, he doesn't really fight against it. When talking about fate throughout the main game, Kratos constantly describes that he doesn't believe in fate. And it's not that I think Kratos doesn't legitimately believe fate doesn't exist. I mean, Kratos obviously knows it does, but as he expresses to Atreus, the person that he's trying to lead to become a better version of himself, what fate says, what fate prophesizes, it doesn't really matter. What matters is who you actually are and who you try to be. You have to separate yourself from this determined outcome of your own story. And if you try to be better, then you will be. Think of Macbeth and all those other classical fate tales. The dramatic irony occurs because these characters got possessed by their fate. They got possessed by their outcome, obsessed with it eventually happening or trying to stop it from happening. Part of the reason why Macbeth turns into a tyrant is chasing his fate. Ragnarok takes all these other stories and tells us how to avoid them. Kratos is smart because he knows that fate can control people. It controlled him in his metaphorical past life, but now he knows about this. He has the knowledge. Now that he's overcome his need to diverge fate, he has acceptance, and he teaches this to Atreus. He expresses how it's important to do good right now, to make good choices in the present and stop looking to the future. That's how you actually become a good person. Okay, I'll admit right now that I initially really didn't love God of War Ragnarok or its story. I thought it was convoluted and driven by moments and characters I had no connection to or who I really didn't care about. I mean, Thor is such a douche in this game, it's insane. I didn't love a lot of the Asgard parts of the game with Atreus, and I still think Atreus can be kind of bratty. And also the Angrboda storyline is really good, but it just feels shoehorned in. All of that being said, I still think that the way that God of War Ragnarok deals with fate is really interesting. The other ways media deals with fate in Macbeth and the original God of War trilogy is really good, but Ragnarok did something that I didn't think any video game could do. It approaches fate in a video game, but from a very non-video game perspective. It doesn't use it for dramatic irony, but it uses it to point out the flaws in our very own way of thought, to point out how no matter what situation you're in, you still have control over who you are as a person. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about fate in God of War Ragnarok. I hope you guys enjoyed what I had to say in this video. Let's get into the brief conclusion, I guess. So there really isn't much more for me to say about this topic, but I just want to again take the 3 uses of fate and really think about it. Macbeth uses fate for dramatic irony. God of War 3 uses fate and turns it into this physical, tangible thing that you can change. And keep in mind, God of War 3 takes what we know about fate in Macbeth and expands upon it. And then God of War Ragnarok takes what we know from both Macbeth and God of War 3 and expands upon it even further. And in this way, if we can see how each one of these sort of pieces of media adds on to each other, we get this grand notion of characters being controlled by fate. Having fate sort of trigger your downfall, using fate to avoid your downfall, and then finally realizing that all of this stuff about fate ultimately harms yourself more than you think it does. Even in God of War 3, where Kratos uses fate, the ending isn't really a good ending for him. And so we can conclude that fate is very important, but a very destructive thing. I highly recommend watching through this movie, playing through the original God of War games and also the newer ones, and overall, the main message of everything tied into a nice, neat bow. Be better and don't let things control who you are as a person. You have the ability to act autonomously, to control who you are now. And that means every single second you have is a second to be introspective on yourself and turn yourself into a better person. Okay, so yeah, video, yay. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about some other things for a bit now. So I was originally really tempted to talk about God of War Ragnarok and the things I didn't like about that game, especially in terms of some of the gameplay segments. Like, especially near the end of the game, I found some parts that were really oddly broken, and it really destroyed my view of that game for a while, and because of that, I don't really love God of War Ragnarok that much. But I decided that would be a pretty good fit for an article on my website, and so before or after this video comes out, if you're interested, you can expect to see something like that on my website. I also want to talk a bit about the fucking thing that just happened to me on this channel. I mentioned it briefly in the middle part of this video, but my video on Fallout and Fallout New Vegas really blew up. It earned me almost exactly 500 subscribers. I think I'm really close to hitting 600 now, and thank you so much if you're from that video and you decided to watch this new thing that I made. I think I expressed in the ending of that video, but I obviously am not going to be able to make some sort of big 3-hour project anymore. I explained in the end of that video, but I basically had a year to make something huge, and so I decided to make that instead of just making a bunch of smaller projects, and let me tell you, I think that it really paid off. Thank you. I'm sorry that this video maybe took a bit to come out. I actually had another video I was making about The Last of Us Part 2. I wrote a whole script on it, and I actually got about 12 minutes into editing it, but eventually I kind of really didn't like what I was saying in that video. I kind of disagreed with it, and I realized that a lot of what I was saying was based more so in fact than the actual emotion of that game when it came out, and so I do want to talk about The Last of Us Part 2 sometime, but I'm not really sure how to do it or what to say about it, so I ended up scrapping that and making this video instead. I actually was completely planned to just not talk about God of War Ragnarok at all in terms of an article or a video, but when I was thinking about what video to make, I was talking to somebody, and I realized I could talk on and on about fate and dramatic irony and, you know, video games and movies and whatnot, and I realized that, oh, that's like exactly what I want for a video, so I decided to make this. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully something new comes out later. I am kind of tired about talking about storylines in video games, so I might take a step back and just talk about, you know, some fun video games for a bit. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. See you in the next video. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Telephone!